Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlewoman from Minnesota for yielding the customary 30 minutes. Mr. Speaker, here we are a little more than 48 hours from a devastating government shutdown. The deadline to pass a federal budget is already 3 months overdue, and the clock keeps ticking. Unable to get control of their majority and act responsibly, Republicans keep kicking the can down the road. They've struggled to pass any legislation because they choose again and again to appease an extremist minority rather than to advance policies supported by the majority of Americans and their representatives here in the House. And now, as we face pressing challenges at home and around the world, they've brought us to the brink of disaster once again, all because they chose to renege on a bipartisan deal to fund the government. So with these serious problems we're facing, what are House Republicans' priorities for today? To attack the president and pass more anti-abortion bills. It's a new year, but for House Republicans, it's the same old story. Distracted by their own chaos and infighting, they have repeatedly failed to deliver for the American people. They've wasted time and tax dollars on baseless investigations and divisive culture wars, dragging the American people with them down rabbit holes of conspiracies and untruths. They throw tantrums when they can't get their way, ousting their last speaker, and just last week bringing all work in the House to a halt because their new speaker had dared to try to strike a deal to keep the government open. They put on dramatic acts of political theater, hoping to hide the fact that they're unable to complete the most basic task of governance. And in 2023, they led the least productive session of Congress since the Great Depression. We think the American people deserve better. So with that in mind, let's look at the 3 bills that House leadership has chosen to spend Congress's time on this week. And it's more of the same. The first bill in this rule is the grotesquely misleading H-Res 957, a resolution that repeats lies and distortions about the migration challenges at our southern border, starting with the title of the resolution and its false claim that this administration is promoting an open border. This is MAGA fiction, and it's an effort to keep campaigning on the fear of immigrants rather than any serious attempt to address the complex issues created by global migration forces and decades of congressional inaction. It's become obvious that our Republican colleagues don't really want to fix the broken immigration system, they just want to campaign on it. They've rejected before even reading the bipartisan solutions proposed by Senate Republicans, Democrats, and the administration. They've refused to consider the supplemental border funding requested by the president, because the truth is they don't want solutions. They want political stunts. They want to rant and complain and blame and campaign. Immigration and border issues are complex. That's why they've remained on the table for so many years. They require comprehensive and nuanced policies, not acts of cruelty and dehumanization marked by barbed wire, family separation, or needless tragedies. As we've seen over and over again, our Republican colleagues would rather use this issue to sow anger, division, and fear. They'll use meaningless resolutions that do nothing to change the status quo, like this one, to distract from their failed Congress and their do-nothing agenda. If you want to see just how House Republicans view immigration and the border as a purely political issue, look no further than House leadership. After saying for months that border security is a crisis, and just last month, taking a field trip with over 60 House Republicans to the border, this week, House leadership refused to even consider a bipartisan deal negotiated in the Senate before they'd read it. You can't say that the border is in a state of emergency, yet reject a bipartisan deal to address the crisis. We can and we must do better than this, and we owe it to our constituents and our country to work towards real, thoughtful solutions rather than partisan talking points like H-Res 957. Now let's turn to H.R. 6914 and 6918. Supporting the health and well-being of mothers and babies should be something we can all agree upon, and we would welcome some real collaboration in that area. But that's not what the majority has brought to the floor today. The fact is that both of these bills are designed to advance an extremist agenda to limit Americans' fundamental freedoms, particularly with respect to reproductive health care. It's nothing but a political exercise that our Republican colleagues undertake every year, on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. It's designed to cater to their most extreme supporters as they descend on Washington, D.C. for an anti-abortion rally. The fact is that the MAGA majority's anti-abortion agenda is wildly unpopular in this country. The vast majority of Americans do not support it, and they have proven that at the polls repeatedly in the last couple of years. Americans do not want politicians and right-wing extremists undermining their freedom to make their own medical and reproductive health care choices based on their own individual circumstances. In the face of the overwhelming and repeated rejection of these extremist attempts to interfere in private medical decisions, Republicans are now cloaking their efforts in family-friendly rhetoric and misleading talking points. So it's important to dig a little deeper and see what these bills are and are not. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle really wanted to support pregnant women and children and families, they'd work with us to address the shameful fact that maternal mortality in our country far exceeds that of our peers. Childbirth is dangerous here in the United States, particularly for Black women and their babies, not because we don't know how to support healthy outcomes, but because of a lack of will or interest from Congress. It's a full-blown crisis, but it doesn't have to be. When it comes to giving our kids brighter futures, we should be talking about powerful tools like the expanded child tax credit, which lifted millions of children out of poverty. We should be strengthening WIC and SNAP, nutrition programs that serve as lifelines for pregnant women, mothers, infants, and families. But instead, this MAGA majority has proposed deep cuts to these nutrition programs. We should pass policies to improve access to high-quality childcare and early education services, nutritious food, comprehensive maternal and infant health care, stable housing, and family-sustaining jobs, because those are the things that would really help kids and families. But the policies that our Republican colleagues have brought before us today in these two bills do none of that. In fact, they would actually divert money away from vulnerable families and ultimately endanger women's lives. H.R. 6914 purports to be concerned with providing information to pregnant college students. Of course, there are obvious and unique challenges to balancing school and parenting, although students and their families can thrive with the right support. But ultimately, this bill doesn't actually provide such support. Instead, it requires that colleges inform students only about the rights and resources for carrying a pregnancy to term, resources, I'll add, for which this House majority has sought to dramatically slash funding. The bill purposely leaves out any requirement for schools to distribute medically accurate information regarding all of the healthcare options available to pregnant women. If this bill were truly about ensuring that pregnant college students have the necessary information to make informed decisions to meet their unique reproductive healthcare needs, it would include information about contraception, abortion, miscarriages, and the services that might be available to them during their pregnancy and after. If the underlying intent of this bill were not clear enough in its one-sided substance, we need only look to the alleged findings section of the bill, which would write into law completely unproven and even false anti-abortion talking points. These are findings that the bill's author could provide no evidence to support when it was marked up in committee. And don't just ask me. Advocates dedicated to advancing civil rights and resources for pregnant and parenting students have expressed deep concerns about this bill, including groups that are experts on this issue, like the Coalition for Pregnant and Parenting Students Advocacy. It's obvious that this MAGA majority doesn't really care about educating and supporting pregnant and parenting students. Instead, they'd rather leave them in the dark and attempt to deny women the freedom to make informed decisions about their own bodies and futures. Lastly, I want to talk about H.R. 6918, another example of House Republicans doubling down on an extreme and unpopular agenda to try to ban abortion care nationwide. This bill is cloaked in a title that most Americans would agree with, the Supporting Pregnant and Parenting Women and Families Act. And in fact, Congress has passed bipartisan legislation to do just that, including through TANF funding, the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. But in recent years, there's been growing evidence and a raft of studies showing that critical TANF aid for families is being diverted to purposes not authorized by Congress. One of the greatest causes of concern is the siphoning of federal TANF taxpayer dollars to support so-called crisis pregnancy centers, most of which are part of a well-funded arm of the global anti-abortion movement. There's a growing body of evidence that these crisis pregnancy centers use deceptive and coercive tactics to target vulnerable people facing unplanned pregnancies, and they often prevent them from accessing a full range of appropriate reproductive health care, including safe abortion care and contraceptives. Just as this bill is cloaked in benign pro-family rhetoric, these pregnancy centers distribute diapers and formula in order to disguise their underlying anti-abortion mission. One of the great dangers of these crisis pregnancy centers is that they present themselves as legitimate healthcare facilities. But the reality is that most are unlicensed, unstaffed by medical professionals, and unbound by the privacy laws that govern medical providers. This has led to women being misled and given inaccurate or even dangerous information about their pregnancies and the options for care that are available to them, including women who have suffered life-threatening, undiagnosed complications in their pregnancies, women who have been denied the information and opportunity to access appropriate reproductive health care for them, and women who have been encouraged to undertake dangerous and medically contraindicated procedures. So there's strong evidence that many pregnancy centers are using the public money that states allocate to them through TANF for purposes that are not authorized by Congress. That's why last year the Department of Health and Human Services issued a proposed regulation to better guide the states in what services were eligible for TANF funding, and that's why this bill, H.R. 6918, is so dangerous and dishonest. When we have a growing mountain of evidence of misuse and even fraudulent use of TANF dollars by crisis pregnancy centers, this bill, by its term, would prevent the Department of Health and Human Services from any regulation of pregnancy crisis centers. House Republicans would greenlight the unregulated use of public money to fund these anti-abortion facilities, many of which have been proven to promote false medical claims and misinformation, misrepresent their services as providing a full range of reproductive health care despite having only anti-abortion services and usually lacking any medical personnel, and horrifyingly, they're unbound by HIPAA privacy restrictions, and some of these centers collect and distribute women's sensitive personal information to organizations within the larger anti-abortion movement. This is what Republicans are trying to push upon American women with these bills, and I wholeheartedly disagree. So here we are, it's another week, and House GOP still can't get their act together. Their majority is on track to become one of the most ineffective in modern history. And again, we're just hours from a government shutdown. But instead of dealing with that or any of the real problems Americans are facing today, this House majority is desperately trying to mask its own failure with misleading rhetoric and bills that will never become law. It would be a joke if it weren't so serious. Led by their most extreme members, it's clear our Republican colleagues don't want to make Congress work better for the American people. They want to break it, and they want to campaign on it. They want to bring chaos to this chamber and pass legislation that feeds the flames of their desperate culture wars. It's irresponsible, it's reckless, and it's not what the American people want. I deeply oppose this rule, and I reserve the remainder of my time.